Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, December 4th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Emma Cotton, who is a reporter for VTDigger. She covers the environment, climate change, energy, and agriculture for VTDigger. Previously, she wrote for the Addison Independent and also served as assistant editor of Vermont Sports and Vermont Ski and Ride magazines. Emma, great to have you back again.
Thanks for having me back, Andrew. It's great to be here.
It's been far too long. I think earlier this year, I think was our last time together. But anyways, great to have you back. I appreciate you making the time for this conversation because the energy and environment and climate change scene has certainly been a busy one for you over the past couple of years, and certainly has been a much discussed one, I think, in the last few months as well. I was wondering, just to kind of get us started here, if we could maybe begin at the 30,000 foot level and kind of think a little bit about, what might possibly be going on with a new incoming administration in Washington, D.C., which seems to be somewhat less, shall I say, climate friendly than the outgoing one. I guess I'm wondering what your sources are telling you about maybe what their concerns are or their expectations, with an administration that seems to be, kind of more excited about fossil fuels and drilling, rather than trying to figure out how we can move forward on, let's say, electric vehicles. Is there any concerns that you're picking up from the folks you talk to in your reporting that say, this is going to be different?
Yeah, I would say I've definitely talked to a few folks who are feeling a bit concerned about this. And I think it's good to sort of put this moment in context a little bit as well. So there's a sort of an international goal to try to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And right now we're hovering right at about 1.2 degrees Celsius. Every zero point 0.1 degree is significant and can cause difficult impacts. And in addition to that, we've seen 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 is set to become the hottest year on record and beat 2023. The oceans are warming and very, very warm and causing hurricanes that are impacting Vermont. I think the incoming administration is really looking to establish energy dominance and open up new places to drill. And I think that's sort of a very different goal than a lot of climate experts who are saying we really need to turn this around and we need to take action now on climate change. So we definitely have some people concerned about broadly what this will do in terms of climate change and how Vermont would be impacted by that. It also has more specific policy implications. We get a lot of funding in Vermont from the federal government. So, for example, the Agency of Natural Resources gets about a third of its budget from the federal government. And under the Biden administration, that funding has greatly expanded. The Biden administration has put kind of an unprecedented amount of funding into the transition into clean energy. So we've seen a lot of funding come into Vermont for things like electric vehicle chargers and incentives for people to install heat pumps and put solar on their roofs and sort of go carbon free, both at sort of a statewide institutional scale and also in individual people's homes. So, a lot of that's come through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I think we've heard Trump say that he wants to repeal what he can from the Inflation Reduction Act, although what's already spent is I don't think he can touch that. We may see the funding in the IRA rolled back, but we also just may see less federal funding in general from the Trump administration. So a few impacts to Vermont for sure.
So if that federal funding was cut back significantly, I mean, would that really kind of put a hold on things like trying to move forward on heat pumps and solar panels and other areas where we might be able to substitute renewable energy for traditional fossil fuels?
I think it could. Yeah, I think it could present sort of a gap for us. I think it also depends on the drive of individuals to take on these projects themselves, and whether they have the resources to be able to do that. You know, a lot of people may not need the, incentives or funding to install solar panels and buy an electric vehicle and that kind of thing. But then, who are you leaving behind if you aren't giving people that help to purchase those kinds of things? So, I think it may be the situation where it's sort of people can choose to adopt those projects if they want to, but other folks may not be able to as easily.
So down here at the state level in Vermont, we've had well, a couple things happening in recent years up at the legislature. In 2020, they passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which sort of set us on a pathway to try and meet some of the climate change goals or carbon emissions reduction goals set forth in the Paris Accords of 2015, if I'm correct. Um, and then subsequent to that, last year they passed the so-called Clean Heat Standard bill, which was fairly controversial. Um, and that, of course, isn't really a bill yet. That was sort of some instructions to the Public Utility Commission, or PUC, to kind of come up with a plan. I wonder if you could walk us through that, where that all stands at the moment. Particularly, we'll start with the Clean Heat Standard, I guess, because I think it's been fairly confusing to a lot of people, myself included, I might add, as to what exactly is being contemplated here.
Yeah, absolutely. The Clean Heat Standard is definitely a complicated program, so I will do my best to walk you through it. But for anyone who's been lost in the process, I'm right there with you. It's tough to understand for sure. So you're exactly right. We pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords in 2017 as a country. A bunch of states decided to stay in and form a climate alliance and commit to those emissions reductions goals themselves. And Vermont did that with the Global Warming Solutions Act. Um, and we have to meet these legally obligated deadlines in 2025, 2030, and 2050. And it's not enough to sort of just say individuals can take on projects themselves and that's going to get us there. We need a plan. Otherwise, it's looking very unlikely that we would meet those deadlines. So, transportation takes up 40% of the emissions that we produce in Vermont. Heating and cooling our buildings takes up 30% of the emissions that we produce here. So the plan to reduce emissions that come from heating and cooling buildings is the Clean Heat Standard, was the Clean Heat Standard, depending on who you talk to right now. So the Clean Heat Standard it's trying to create a pool of money and labor to transition people over to heating systems that don't pollute as much. So, not using as much heating fuel or not using heating fuel at all. Instead, you're using a heat pump, you're weatherizing a home, you're installing more efficient appliances. Um, and so the way they were going to get that pool of money and labor is by sort of requiring that fuel dealers who are importing heating fuel into Vermont would have sort of an obligation. They would have to offset the emissions that are coming from their products by paying a fee or installing some of those cleaner burning heating solutions themselves. And so the tricky part of this is that a lot of people may choose to make that transition, and the Clean Heat Standard may help make that more affordable for some people because it's creating more labor and more um, money to sort of feed into it. But for the people who don't make that transition because they can't afford it or they may not be able to, it's really complicated for people who, for example, are living in mobile homes. Um, they may have to pay more because fuel dealers may need to increase their own prices because of the fee that the Clean Heat Standard is passing on to them. So there has been like a pretty significant campaign by folks who oppose the Clean Heat Standard, which generally includes a lot of fuel dealers and a lot of Republicans. Governor Scott has been against this since the very beginning. Um, and you know, I think right now in Vermont, affordability is a really, really big issue. I think we saw that come up both in the statewide and the national election, right? People are talking about how hard it is to sort of pay for the cost of living at this point. So I think we saw that maybe not specifically around the clean heat standard. I think it was more related to property taxes, but when people were voting, we saw the Democrat supermajority broken in the legislature, which may have had something to do, probably had something to do with that idea about affordability, excuse me. And so now in terms of process, the clean heat standard, as you said, um, there was a law passed that required the state's Public Utility Commission to set up and study a clean heat standard and determine what it might actually cost people. And the legislature is set to take a look at that plan in the coming session. Um, and from there, they can decide to change it, they can decide to drop it, they can decide to just move on, or they can decide to try to move it forward. If they do move it forward, even if it passes both chambers, it's almost certain to face a veto from the governor. And I think at this point, they probably don't have the votes to override that veto. So the path for the clean heat standard is looking more and more difficult, I think. But going back to the Global Warming Solutions Act, then that begs the question, we have to meet this 2030 deadline. What are we going to do about it?
Right, because that was the mechanism by which we were going to reach these climate goals. Well, if not a clean heat standard as the credit market, I guess that was envisioned in the kind of the original version of that. I mean, I've heard some state officials say that, well, maybe a simpler way to go would be to just have a fuel tax. You don't set up a complicated credit market. We just slap a tax on it, and that's how we're going to get the money. Does that, give in the context of what you were just talking about there, the political realities of that we saw, last month, affordability is a huge question. Anything that will increase the cost of living will be a very difficult pill to swallow, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. The sort of like what's next, if not the clean heat standard. I've heard folks talk about a fuel tax. I've heard folks talk about a cap and invest program in the thermal sector. But I think really what we're starting to hear the most about is maybe taking a look at the Global Warming Solutions Act itself and potentially moving the 2030 deadline, pushing it back a few years. Because I think what we have happening now is we're sort of like college students who needed to write a big paper that was due at midnight. And it's, the assignment maybe is 1,000 words and it's 11 o'clock and we still have 1,000 words to write. We haven't really made a lot of progress, but we still have the same amount of work to do. And so the longer you wait, the harder it gets, right? So I think when we had 10 years to reduce emissions, we would have had to do less each year. But now that we only have 5 years, any program we put in place to try to meet that 2030 deadline is going to have to be pretty aggressive. Um, I mean, you can set a tax at different rates, right? You can set any program, sort of adjust it to make sure that we meet that deadline. And at this point, it's going to be likely be hard for folks unless we find some sort of silver bullet. So I think folks are starting to talk about moving the deadline back to 2035, and you have a lot of frustration from environmental advocates who have been saying, we've been asking you to pass this stuff since 2020 and we had 10 years then, what's going to change now? But I think, given the sort of dynamics of this new legislature, I think it's possible that we could see a change to the Global Warming Solutions Act, maybe rather than constructing a new program to reduce emissions in the heating sector.
Now, wasn't there also a provision in there that if the state didn't reach those goals, the state could be sued? People, I mean, would that be thrown out too, that provision, if the entire act was just sort of ended?
Yeah, I think it's tricky to say now how they're going to change the law. I think environmental advocates are pretty really want there to be an accountability measure in the law that holds us accountable for meeting those emissions. Otherwise, it seems like we're having trouble even when there is that measure in there. So take it out, and I think there's the question of whether we make progress here. I do think that that's something that Governor Scott wants to see. But something I've also heard from agency folks, including Julie Moore, is this idea of agents. Julie Moore is the secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, and she has, sort of floated the idea of pushing that 2030 deadline back a few years, potentially to 2035. And I think that's something, if the goal remains to sort of decarbonize entirely by 2050, you may see some people get on board, even some Democrats potentially get on board with adjusting that middle deadline. But I know that there are still a lot of people who are concerned about tweaking that act in any way. So it's also an interesting dynamic given that Trump is taking office now, and I think a lot of the responsibility to reduce emissions is going to come back to states, even though we'll have less help to do that. But I think, there's a lot that sort of goes into this moment right now. So
Wow. Yeah. That's an amazing confluence of factors in play here. I just wondered, the state also has a climate action plan. Is that the same as the Global Warming Solutions Act, or is that sort of a broader, here are the targets we want to meet as we go down towards, I think, 2050? Is that what that's about?
that's a good question. I feel like there's so many different bodies, yeah, that are sort of working to sort of try to figure out the same things. But the Climate Council is a body that was created through the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's a number of state officials and other stakeholders who are appointed to that council, whose job it is to come together and make recommendations about how we meet those emissions reductions requirements. Um, so, they've been meeting, they came out with a climate action plan in 2021 that gave a bunch of recommendations about how we meet, um, the targets. And some of those have been adopted, some of them haven't. And now they're getting together at this point, and getting ready to update that plan, which the new plan is, I think, scheduled to come out in July of 2025, but their recommendations are due in mid-December. So they're sort of in the throes of trying to figure out what to do next. But every action that they come up with has to be then adopted by either, state government or the legislature for the most part. So it really takes cooperation from a number of other folks. It's not like we write the climate action plan and that's it. It's sort of the first step in a number of steps.
Well, it's all quite remarkable. I mean, we think, I guess we think of Vermont a lot, or at least some people have, prior to 2023 and the flooding we saw, and then again last year, as something of a climate haven. I remember that was one term that was being bandied about. I haven't heard that quite as frequently lately, but I mean, when you think about the potential impacts of climate change on Vermont and the state economy, I mean, you're looking at things like what, the ski industry, maple syrup, fall foliage. There's an awful lot at stake here for the state, it seems, if we don't kind of, make some headway somewhere. And realizing, of course, that Vermont is just one part of the much bigger picture that, really covers the entire planet, I suppose. Right?
Yeah, I don't know about you. I've been trying to do a little cross-country skiing in the last couple of years, and I've been finding it increasingly difficult. I live near Burlington, to try to find a reliable patch of snow in the winter. I think we're seeing that snowpack become less and less reliable, and we're seeing the ski industry, the downhill ski industry, try to adapt by, getting more efficient, snow blowing technology. Of course, that's very resource intensive as well. And you're right. I think that I've heard sort of mixed opinions about why some of the foliage, particularly last year, was a little bit duller in color. But I think that some of that might have had to do with how much moisture there was and how much water there was around from the flooding. So it's sort of like the pieces of Vermont's identity, along with, of course, like the devastating impacts of the flooding that we've seen now 2 years in a row. I think we are really learning that Vermont is not a climate haven. And I think this moment is so interesting because we're seeing a lot of frustration around affordability, and folks really struggling to be able to pay the bills at the same time as we're seeing climate change become much less of a hypothetical and something that we have to pay for and deal with as it happens to us. And so I think, it's a really difficult and interesting conversation how we manage this in such a small state with such limited resources. And I think you can see people debating, is it our job to take this on and pay a lot of money to try to fix this problem? And a lot of people say, yes, that's the right thing to do, and we need to set the standard, and other states will follow us. They have in the past. And then you see, other folks saying, we just have too much on our plates right now. We don't have the capacity to do this. So watching that conversation play out is just really interesting. And I think it's only going to get more intense as a discussion this next year as climate change progresses and as we see this new administration take office as well.
Well, it'll be certainly interesting to follow your reporting on this as the legislature comes back into session next month. But in the time we have left, I just wanted to shift gears a little bit and have you talk a little bit about some of your recent stories that you've had published in VTDigger. I mean, one of the ones that caught my eye over the last couple of weeks was one you had about the potential for a lot of immigrant farm workers here in Vermont who, are kind of an important component of the state's dairy industry as well as, I guess, across the entire agricultural sector. But I mean, there's been a lot of concerns that if some of these workers who might not have their immigration documents precisely set might be deported. Again, the incoming administration has made that a kind of a large talking point that illegal immigrants would be rounded up and sent home, I guess. What impact would that have, do you think, on Vermont's agricultural sector? That sounds like that would be a kind of a difficult thing to overcome.
Yeah, yeah, I think it would be. I think in the past few years, decades, we've seen dairy farms consolidate, and a lot of the surviving dairy farms are the bigger dairy farms. And a lot of those dairy farms rely on immigrant labor to keep their operations going. These folks are typically doing jobs that not a lot of other folks are raising their hands for. It's really hard, sort of dangerous work. And these folks are signing up to do it. And I spoke with a few experts who said, we're really going to find out if this does happen, how much we rely on these folks. If that population were to vanish from Vermont, I think we would see dairy farms close at a faster rate than is already happening. And I think it's also just really important to say, I spoke with a couple of folks who are undocumented and trying to figure out how to process this moment. And there is definitely a lot of fear in that community. I think we recently saw Trump confirm that he's planning to sort of issue, I think, like an emergency declaration and potentially, use the military to carry this out. It's still really difficult to know whether he will concentrate this effort in Vermont. I think he may have sort of like bigger fish to fry in other places, but we are also a border state, and so there is that presence here as well. So yeah, we'll see what happens. It's certainly something that we're going to be following.
Yeah, that would be quite a change for sure. Uh, well, another story that just came out today in Digger was one about wake boats on Vermont lakes. Now, wake boats, that refers to the wake that a boat causes when it's moving forward through the lake. I mean, what's that all about? They want to some lake associations want to create some restrictions on these boats, or what's going on here?
Yeah, so there was a rule that was debated very passionately for a long time and then went into effect in April that banned wake boats from a number of smaller lakes, inland lakes. I think wake boats there's some research to suggest that the wakes can, cause environmental degradation to like the shorelines. It can disrupt the lake bottom, and cause, like for nesting birds and different creatures on the shoreline and in the lake bottom, it can be sort of destructive. And so this rule sort of banned wakeboating on a lot of the smaller lakes, but there's 30 lakes in Vermont where this remains an allowed activity. And we're starting to see, I think there's 9 lake associations covering 10 lakes, and they have petitioned the state to not allow wakeboating there either. A lot of these lakes haven't seen a lot of wakeboating yet, but I think some of them are concerned that because wakeboating has been disallowed on other lakes, that it might be concentrated on their lakes. So, I think there's some public safety concerns involved with this and environmental concerns as well. So, sort of interesting to see this. I think a lot of people, when the rule passed, were pushing for more stringent regulations than had passed, even though the rule is the strictest in the country. So now we're sort of seeing these individual lakes say, not here either, and sort of trying to outlaw it where they are as well. So, I think if these petitions move forward, we'll see like 20 remaining lakes in Vermont where this activity is allowed. So slowly shrinking the territory for wakeboating. But yeah, really, I think this is an issue that a lot of people care very passionately about and have shown up to talk about. So it's been an interesting one to follow as well.
And another one of yours recently I found interesting was one about the invasive golden clams found in Lake Champlain. I thought that was a milfoil issue, but I hadn't realized that golden clams were also a problem. Is that something that's just restricted to Lake Champlain, or again, perhaps are they being found elsewhere?
Yeah, so the folks I talked to about this said that it was really disappointing to find the clam in the lake, but wasn't super surprising because the clam has been in Lake Bomazene and Lake George, both which sort of have pathways that connect to Lake Champlain. So in a way, it was sort of a matter of time until they found their way into Lake Champlain. These guys are really hard to control. I talked to someone from Lake Bomazene from Lake George, who sort of illustrated all of these mats that they put down on the lake bed to try to kill off the clams that existed there, but their young are exist in the water column and are sort of swimming around. And so even if you kill all of the ones in the lake bed, they can still reestablish themselves. They're very good at reproducing. And so I think there have been a few clams now found in southern Lake Champlain, but I imagine that we'll see that population become a bit more established. So far, they haven't had any huge ecosystem impacts, which is good. But they can sort of clog infrastructure if there's too many of them in one place. So I think that's something to, keep an eye out for.
Mm. Well, sounds like you're going to have plenty of stories to write about, or subjects to write about next year as we get on into 2025. No shortage of story opportunities, it sounds like. Well, I guess we're going to have to leave it there for today. But Emma, once again, thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. Always a pleasure hearing about your reporting. And yeah, I guess no spoiler alert or anything, but is there any energy story that you've kind of got on your radar that you're looking forward to doing more research on before it gets out into VTDigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were talking about a little bit earlier about the sort of convergence of this moment with affordability concerns and the way that climate change is becoming more real here is something I'm interested in following, just sort of as an idea. I'm honestly, I think the Clean Heat Standard and whatever comes next with the Global Warming Solutions Act will be something that we follow very closely. Um, and, I think also the Climate Council, has such a difficult job. You have these people coming together, they have their day jobs, but they come together on this council to try to figure out how the state of Vermont is going to reduce its emissions. And I think that's a difficult endeavor and something that I also want to dig into maybe a little later in December when these recommendations come out. So definitely no shortage of things to write about right now.
All right, well, great. Well, thanks again for making the time for this chat. Emma Cotton is a reporter for VTDigger. She covers the energy, environment, and agricultural scene and climate change. And Emma, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be here.
And thanks to all of you who've been with us, and hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Take care.